So I'm thinking about procreation. I'm thinking about the production of children in society. And I'm wondering a couple of things, I suppose. So one thing I'm wondering is how many people who are walking around, how many people who are born were intended to be produced by the parents? And how many were the result of unintended pregnancy? It's a very difficult thing to try and guess who was intended to be created and who was an accidental result of sex. It's quite a difficult thing to judge. I think that it's most likely that most people who are alive today were intended to be produced by the parents. I think that's most likely. It's quite a high degree. But I also think a lot of people walking around today were not intended to be produced. And even many people were not wanted at all. But the parents had to just accept the reality of these children. So I think it's interesting to wonder who was intended, or rather, how many people were intended and how many were an accident, unintended consequence of sex. As I say, I think most children were intended, but a great many, I'm sure, were not intended. I'm also thinking something else about sex, and I was wondering something. I was wondering how many people would be born if sex was not so pleasurable, if there was no joy to sex, if it was just an activity to produce children, a functional activity with no pleasure associated with it, no orgasm, no pleasure of a man entering a woman. It was just a functional activity, like going to the toilet or something. I'm wondering how the population will be affected if sex was not so appealing. Because I'm thinking nature has made it designed the situation such that sex is desired by people for the sake of having sex, not necessarily to produce children. Nature has made people want to have sex irrespective of having children, where children were not desired, it wasn't the purpose. But then many children are born anyway, even if the parents didn't intend to make children. So I'm wondering if there was a situation where the parents could choose explicitly whether any sexual encounter would produce a child, what would happen to the birth rate then? In other words, how many people are born today who were not intended to be created by the parents? It'd be interesting to know the proportion of people who were intended and the proportion who were an accident, if you like, unintended results of sex. I do think that most people who are around today were intended by their parents. But I also know that a large number of people were not intended to be produced. just don't know how to judge the proportion. But I think it is interesting to wonder how many people were intended and how many were an accident.